Garamayagat Linda agus Garamayagav Galera Soktan Yesha Harsham Larch and Shaw and you. I was going through my phone on Wednesday and Gavin Riley, I don't know if he's still here, he tweeted an audible groan of disappointment from the McGill crowd as they're told Luke Flanagan won't make it on Friday and is replaced by Matt Carthy. And I thought to myself, that's going to be a tough audience. Here was me thinking the McGill Summer School was full of closet shinners, but it did. I was delighted to accept the invitation, even at late notice, because it gave me a perfect excuse to spend the weekend with the family in Gweedore, which we do probably 3 or 4 times a year. So, if for no other reason, I thank Joe for that, and then, of course, my excitement only grew when I seen the topic that I was asked to speak on, the future of the European Union reform or the decline. I said, geez, I was only second choice at best for that subject. But anyway, my political philosophy starts with the premise that decisions affecting communities should be made as close to those communities as possible. That's my starting point when I'm assessing political structures and the basis that I look at European politics. I think it's true to say that the European Union is at a crossroads. The public in Ireland especially, but elsewhere, are clearly uncomfortable with the direction that the EU has been taken. There's growing anger at the policies that it's pursuing and, in my view, the disregard for those of us who live in particularly what are considered small peripheral states. And the rejection of the proposed EU constitution a number of years ago signalled a clear lack of appetite for a federal Europe, even among those countries that came together to form the original EEC. The French and the Dutch people, as we know, voted against the EU constitution. Their governments didn't dare ask them to vote a second time, but instead they colluded with other European leaders to basically bring about the provisions of the constitution in by stealth. And most of that constitution, as is now on public record, was actually contained in the Lisbon Treaty, which the Irish people did vote on and reject. And, of course, we had to vote a second time, and in the course of it we were promised jobs and investment at a time when there was a massive shortage of both. The EU is plagued by criticism of a democratic deficit at its core. Public confidence, as has already been pointed out by Rory, in EU institutions is at an all-time low. According to the Eurobarometer, which is the EU's own official polling body, public trust has halved since before the crisis, and EU leaders and institutions have demonstrated beyond doubt that they are incapable of resolving the economic and social crisis that was caused by their politics and policies. Many member states have voters that, through the most recent election results, did send a very clear message to not only the European institutions but their own governments. And the results, I have to say, in my view, demonstrate the failures of Europe. Peripheral member states, particularly, are bearing the brunt of unemployment, emigration and poverty. The austerity agenda that has been very much driven at the European level isn't working. Low and middle income families, small businesses, those trying to make a living off family farms, they're struggling to survive, while the perception is very much that the wealthy and large corporations are benefiting as a result of European politics. And the election results were a call to action, and they should have and could have signalled a clear change in direction on the part of European leaders. Many of us, I have to say, were watching very carefully the very first meeting of the European Council to see if the message from the voters had been received. And rather than announce a single change in policy or direction, the Council basically spent its first meeting after the elections concentrating on what was in effect a secret carve-up of the top jobs within the institutions. Nothing learned. And the first big decision that our own government has had to make since the election was the announcement of the next Commissioner. So if Fine Gael and Labour had heeded the message from voters, they would have and could have nominated somebody who represented a break from the old boys club, a break from the usual Fianna Fáil type crony black slapping move of using positions like this to reward party loyalty rather than to put somebody who would be a credit to our country and who would be up for the job. What did they do? They nominated basically the epitome of cronyism. Phil Hogan has been nominated to the Commissioner because he was loyal to Enda Kenny during the leadership heave. And despite the fact that he has failed as a minister, that questions are undoubtedly going to be raised at a European level about his record, it appears that the Labour Party, disappointingly, are content to support the nomination. And I'd like to use this opportunity to again call on the Government to withdraw the nomination and put forward somebody who we can all support as Irish representatives in Europe, and otherwise it will be just another case of nothing being learned. I know, because I've spent well over a year in a European campaign, travelling around 15 counties of the Midlands North West constituency, that there is a justifiable anger at how we as a country were treated during the economic crisis. And of course, there were severe and drastic failures on the part of our own government, but the needs and rights of Irish citizens were far from the top of the agenda at those at the helm of the EU. For too long, a consensus has existed in Irish politics, and the consensus extends from economic and social policy to Ireland's relationship within the EU. And it's very much a sense, I have to say, when I met local communities in counties like Donegal and parishes surrounding where we are today, that whatever Brussels or Frankfurt say, we do. And there's never been a real discussion about the kind of EU that we want to be part of. We're basically told it's take it or leave it. The EU gives us grants and lets students study abroad, and if you don't support any given treaty, it means we have to leave it. Like, that's it, it's in or out. And there has been, up to this point especially, no space in the debate for those of us who are critical of the EU and the decisions that it's taken, other than to be dismissed as Eurosceptics. And attitudes like this aren't just unique to Ireland, but in this country in particular, it's almost been taboo to be critical of the European Union or the trajectory that it's on. And I would argue that some of our representatives have almost been fawning in their attitudes to the EU and those who are at its helm. And it's this attitude that ultimately allowed Ireland to be bullied when we needed the EU to act in the best interests of our people. Irish governments, in my view, have repeatedly failed to stand up for Ireland, from the deal on fisheries way back when we joined the EEC to the recapitalisation of the Irish banks and the failure to burn the bondholders in more recent time. An unelected bureaucrat, the former president of the Central Bank, Jean-Claude Trichet, was allowed to basically stample and threaten a sovereign state. And Irish governments have repeatedly endorsed wholesale the European Commission's right-wing and social economic agenda, actually stripping back the gains that earlier battles had seen to build up a social Europe. And I think when we're discussing this and Ireland's position and our attitude, I think the comments made by Philippe Legrain, a former advisor to the outgoing Commission President Manuel Barroso, who described the incredible arrogance of EU officials regarding how Ireland was treated during the financial crisis, I think are worth repeating here, because he argued that Ireland was effectively bullied by the EU. And this is a direct quote. "It was outrageous of Germany, the European Commission and above all the ECB to threaten to force Ireland out of the euro if it did not follow through with that foolish guarantee, lumbering Irish people who have already suffered enough from collapsing house prices and a sinking economy with a €64 billion bill to bail out bust banks. €14,000 for every man, woman and child." He went on to argue that Ireland's partners abused the fact that it desperately wanted to be part of the euro. And importantly, he stated that Ireland needs to play hardball now. Irish people have been the victims of bad government in Ireland and bad decisions in Europe. And during the most recent European elections, we in Sinn Féin campaigned on a platform that our representatives, if elected, would fight for changes, including an end to the failed policies of austerity and that forces the burden of economic adjustment on low and middle income families, and a definitive break of the link between sovereign and bank debt. We also stood for an EU-wide banking regulation that forces financial institutions to pay their fair share of the costs of the crisis, not just in the future, but from the start of the current crisis, and a new focus on EU-wide investment to get Ireland and Europe's unemployed millions back to work. I believe the reason I was elected is because a significant proportion of voters agreed that we needed to be sent into the European Parliament, and as our representatives indeed on the European Commission, people who will stand up for the best interests of the Irish people. There are those we know who have very strong views that want the EU to become a federal state, which in effect means taking an increasing amount of decision-making further away from the people. The problem they have is that most of the Irish people, and indeed probably a majority of the population of the EU as a whole, don't want to see this happen, and that is the part of the reason why there's a growing gulf between the EU institutions and the people of Europe. I believe that most people in Ireland and across Europe agree with my starting point, that decisions that affect them should be made as close to them as possible. And for this reason, Sinn Féin is actually seeking support for a new EU convention with an explicit mandate to identify competencies that can be returned to member states. When the single currency was created, we warned, along with many others, of the dangers, particularly for small and economically weaker member states. The Dublin government at the time ignored these warnings and signed up to a currency union that was fraught, we now know, with flaws. It was a disaster waiting to happen. And to this day, the EU and the ECB have failed to accept their share of the responsibility for what happened in Ireland. The democratic deficit within the EU and calls for institutional reform are not new. However, the crisis has probably exposed a more fundamental political crisis which urgently needs to be addressed. Successive waves of treaty change from Maastricht to Lisbon have made matters worse, not better. The Commission has too much power, the Council is shrouded in secrecy, and larger member states have disproportionate influence in the Council itself. And this has to change, in my view. The EU needs to be streamlined. It needs to focus on its core functions, and it needs less power, not more. Unless these issues are addressed, I believe the public confidence in the European Union and its institutions across member states is going to continue to fall. So what do we want? Sinn Féin want the power of the Commission reduced by ending the exclusive right for it to propose legislation without even being requested to do so in many instances by the Council or the Parliament. We want to see a lifting of the secrecy surrounding the European Council by ensuring that meetings are held in public and that full minutes are provided. We want to see increased power for smaller member states by reforming the operation of the qualified majority voting, as well as an increase in the number of MEPs elected from smaller member states. And I want changes to strengthen the ability of individual member state parliaments to influence legislative proposals. And one thing that I felt strongly about, but that feeling has only grown, I have to say, since my election to the Parliament, is an urgent need to reduce the influence on corporate lobbyists in Brussels and Strasbourg. It is mind-boggling, the access that they have to the Parliament. And notwithstanding my earlier remarks about the current nominee, we also need to ensure that we maintain the position of one Commissioner per member state, and we need to make that Commissioner accountable to the Parliament of that member state through a process of approval by and regular reporting back to the member state parliaments. Irish governments have a major role to play in the reform of how Europe does its business. When I was travelling around, and it's something that I've continued to do since the election, and when you talk about Europe to the people of Ireland, especially rural Ireland, you will be told about farmers being tied up in excessive red tape. You'll be told about turf cutters who are being stopped from cutting their turf to heat their own homes. You'll be told about how the EU liberalisation policies have threatened the future of public services and rural post offices, and you'll hear about how the local schools have been forced to pay water charges because of the EU Water Services Directive, and you'll hear countless tales of how European bureaucracy has impacted negatively on people's lives. And they're all true and very real complaints. What you don't hear enough, as often as you should, not even from people like the preferred speaker who was intended to be here, is that for every single one of those bad European laws, directives or regulations, at some point an Irish government minister sat in a secret council of ministers meeting and approved them. And in a lot of the cases, Irish MEPs actually voted for them in Strasbourg. So I see it as an integral part of my job as an MEP to try and identify those measures that are coming through Europe that will impact on our communities, so that we can try and initiate debate here before they are adopted 5 or 10 years later. Because in many cases, it's true to say, and I know people who would have a fundamentally different attitude to the European Union would agree with me on this, that Irish governments have used Europe with inverted commas as the reason why bad things. We have to do it because Europe is forcing us to do it, without any mention of the fact that it was Irish representatives who either agreed because they didn't know exactly what it meant, or because they saw it was a convenient way to bring in a measure without having any public discourse here in Ireland. So over the past 5 years, I think that there has been a growing stand against what's essentially a Brussels consensus, and we in Sinn Féin have tried to highlight the negative impact of the policies of austerity and the erosion of democracy as we see it on the lives of people in Ireland. And we've also opposed cuts to the actual EU budget for what we consider to be important strategic sectors, whether it be agriculture, regional development or investment in jobs and growth. So it's time, and there is a time and there is an opportunity for a new direction in Europe and in Ireland. And it's time to, across the board, halt the attack on the wages and conditions of working people and to promote a basic threshold of decency for all. It's time to put in place real supports for those who have been forced out of work by the policies of austerity. And it's time to rebuild public services and defend public utilities to ensure that people get the services they need in a fair and efficient manner. And it's time, I firmly believe, for Ireland to stand up for Irish interest. I believe that if the EU is to have a future, we need to end the Brussels power grab, to rein in the Commission and return powers to Member States. We need decisions that affect communities to be made as close to those communities as possible. The question was reform or decline. Actually, the European Union needs both. Gora míle maith agaibh go leor.